Before dawn on August 1, 1943, a formation of 178 B-24 Liberators thundered into the air from Benghazi, Libya. Their destination, Ploiești, Romania, the heart of Hitler's oil empire. Known as Operation Tidal Wave, it was one of the most daring and catastrophic air missions of World War II. The plan was audacious: strike low at treetop level to destroy the oil refineries supplying nearly one-third of the Third Reich's fuel. It would become a mission etched in both courage and tragedy, one that went horribly wrong before it ever reached its target. The crews of the 8th and 9th U.S. Air Forces were told this mission could shorten the war. They trained for weeks in the desert heat, practicing low-level bombing runs over mock refineries built in the Libyan sands. Colonel Jacob Smart had designed the operation with surgical precision, while General Yücel Ent assured his men that surprise was their greatest weapon. But intelligence underestimated the defenses of Ploiești. The Germans had long anticipated an attack and turned the area into a fortress. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, radar-guided spotlights, and smoke generators stood ready. The skies above the oil fields would become a cauldron of fire. As the sun climbed higher, the first wave of B-24s crossed the Danube River and descended to less than 200 feet. Dust trailed from their wingtips as they skimmed over villages and fields. Civilians on the ground watched in disbelief, massive bombers roaring so low they could see the pilots' faces. Then disaster struck. A navigation error by Colonel Keith K. Compton's group led several squadrons off course, breaking the carefully timed formation. Instead of approaching from the north, many aircraft veered straight into the heaviest flak concentrations south of the city. At 10 a.m. the skies erupted. Black bursts of flak tore through aluminum and flesh alike. The Liberator Hell's Wench caught fire, rolling onto its side before exploding midair. Captain John L. Gerstad refused to abandon his burning aircraft, holding formation until his bombs were away, his final act of defiance before his plane disintegrated over the Astra Romana refinery. On the ground, flames from ruptured fuel tanks lit the horizon for miles. The noise was deafening, engines screaming, bombs detonating, and anti-aircraft cannons pounding relentlessly. One airman, Staff Sergeant Lloyd Hughes, piloted his bomber so low that oil from ruptured tanks sprayed across his windshield. He pressed on, releasing his payload directly over the target before crashing into the inferno below. For such valor, he would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. In all, 53 aircraft were lost, 660 men killed or captured, and the mission's strategic effect fell far short of expectations. The refineries were damaged but quickly repaired. The cost in lives and machines outweighed the temporary blow to Germany's fuel reserves. Yet, in the aftermath, a strange silence lingered. Dozens of planes simply vanished, no crash sites, no survivors, no reports from German ground units. Families back home received telegrams marked missing in action. Some believed the men were captured and sent to hidden labor camps. Others thought they had gone down in the vast forests of Romania or the Balkans, their wrecks swallowed by time. Post-war searches uncovered fragments of wreckage, but many stories remained unresolved, locked somewhere between the clouds and the earth. Decades later, historians pieced together the chaos of that day from German reports and the few surviving pilots' testimonies. They discovered that some groups had bombed the wrong targets entirely: rail yards, warehouses, even decoy installations deliberately placed by the Germans. The mission's element of surprise had been lost the moment the first formation was spotted crossing the Black Sea coast. Radio silence, navigational missteps, and communication breakdowns had turned coordination into confusion. Operation Tidal Wave stands as both a testament to human bravery and the limits of air power. It demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most advanced bombers when deprived of precision and support. More importantly, it exposed the human side of war, where courage often collides with chaos. General Hap Arnold would later describe it as one of the most gallant and tragic episodes of the air war. Today, Ploiești skies remain quiet, but fragments of those B-24s still surface in Romanian fields, pieces of aluminum twisted by heat, found by farmers decades after the war. Each fragment tells a story of men who flew into fire, believing their mission could end the war faster, unaware they were flying into one of history's deadliest traps. Operation Tidal Wave was meant to be a single, decisive strike. Instead, it became a haunting lesson in how intelligence errors, communication failures, and sheer human determination can collide in a single day. The wreckage of that mission marked only the beginning of a series of Allied air operations that would test the limits of courage and endurance, as new missions, equally daring and equally dangerous, took shape in the skies over Europe. And soon, another would rise, a British plan to shatter the heart of Germany's industrial power with a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen. In the spring of 1943, as the smoke of Ploiești still hung heavy over Europe, British engineers and aviators prepared for a different kind of mission, one that would combine precision, invention, and danger on a scale never before attempted. Its codename was Operation Chastise. To the men of RAF 617 Squadron, it would soon be known simply as the Dambusters Raid, a mission that would test the very boundaries of courage and engineering ingenuity. The target was Germany's Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of the Reich. It powered factories, supplied steel, and fueled the Nazi war machine. The British Air Ministry believed that by breaching the great dams, the Möhne, Eder, and Sorp, they could cripple production and flood entire supply lines. But there was a problem. Traditional bombs couldn't penetrate the thick concrete walls of the dams. A new weapon was needed, something that could strike underwater with pinpoint accuracy. Enter Barnes Wallis, a soft-spoken engineer whose idea of a bouncing bomb seemed as mad as it was brilliant. Wallis theorized that if a spinning bomb were dropped at the right height and speed, it would skip across the water like a stone, roll down the dam wall, and detonate deep underwater. The resulting shockwave would collapse even the most fortified structure. Wallis's tests on the coast of Kent were astonishing. The weapon worked. But turning theory into reality would demand men willing to risk everything. The newly formed 617 Squadron, handpicked by Wing Commander Guy Gibson, began secret training at RAF Scampton. The men flew modified Avro Lancaster bombers, stripped of armor to reduce weight, with a massive cylindrical bomb mounted beneath. Training runs were carried out at night, across English reservoirs, often at altitudes of just 60 feet. Pilots learned to fly so low that treetops brushed their wings. It felt like racing death itself, recalled Flight Lieutenant David Maltby in his journal. One mistake and you're a memory. On the night of May 16, 1943, under a clear moon, 19 Lancasters took off in waves from Scampton. The crews were young, most in their early 20s. Their mission was to fly across the North Sea, penetrate deep into German airspace, and destroy the Möhne and Eder dams. They would fly low to avoid radar, sometimes just 50 feet above the water. Gibson led the first wave. There was no turning back, he later wrote. Only forward into the dark. As they crossed into occupied Europe, searchlights swept the sky, and flak exploded around them. One bomber hit power lines and disintegrated. Another was torn apart by anti-aircraft fire. Of the 19 aircraft, only 11 reached their targets. When Gibson's formation approached the Möhne Dam, they found it protected by fierce gunfire. At 12:28 a.m., Gibson made his run, his aircraft roaring barely above the water, engines screaming, the bomb spinning beneath. He released it perfectly. Seconds later, the explosion sent a towering plume of water into the night. 4 more bombers followed. On the 5th drop, the dam cracked and then gave way. The flood that followed was catastrophic. A wall of water surged through the valley, destroying bridges, power stations, and entire villages. German reports later described the sound as the earth itself splitting open. Hours later, the Eder Dam was also breached. The Sorp, however, with its earthen structure, held firm despite multiple attacks. When the surviving crews returned to England, exhausted and shaken, only 11 of the original 19 bombers made it back. 53 airmen were dead or missing. Churchill called it one of the most brilliant operations of the war. Yet, behind the celebration lay darker truths. Thousands of civilians, including forced laborers and prisoners, drowned in the floods. The Germans rebuilt the dams within months. Strategically, the damage was temporary, but the psychological impact was enormous. The raid proved that Allied precision and ingenuity could reach deep into the Reich's core. The men of 617 Squadron were hailed as heroes, and Guy Gibson received the Victoria Cross. Still, mysteries remain. Several aircraft disappeared without trace. Some were last heard radioing "bomb gone" before vanishing from radar. Decades later, wreckage fragments were found scattered in forests across Germany and the Netherlands, silent witnesses to a night of heroism and sacrifice. Historians still debate whether all the lost crews fell to enemy fire or to the inherent dangers of such low-level flying in the dead of night. Barnes Wallis never recovered from the loss of the men who carried his invention into battle. "I've destroyed them with my mind," he once confessed, mourning the cost of his creation. For him, and for those who flew, Operation Chastise was a haunting paradox, a triumph of engineering shadowed by tragedy. The Dambusters' legacy would endure, but so would the questions: how much of the mission's success was worth the human toll? And could any operation that demanded such precision ever be repeated? The answers would come months later in the skies over Germany, when thousands of Allied bombers would once again be ordered to risk everything to break the Luftwaffe's hold on Europe. By early 1944, the Allied air war had reached a deadly stalemate. Every bombing raid over Germany came at a terrible cost. Dozens of aircraft lost, hundreds of men missing. The Luftwaffe's defenses were fierce and their pilots battle-hardened. Something had to break. The plan that emerged would become one of the most ambitious aerial offensives of the war. Operation Argument, known to history as Big Week. Its objective, destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground, clearing the skies for the upcoming invasion of Europe. It began on February 20, 1944. Across airfields in England, Italy, and North Africa, the roar of engines filled the cold morning air. More than 1,000 bombers and 800 fighters prepared to launch in coordinated waves against aircraft factories deep inside the Reich. Targets included the Messerschmitt works at Regensburg, the Focke-Wulf plant at Gotha, and the Heinkel facilities in Leipzig and Schweinfurt. The American 8th Air Force under General Jimmy Doolittle would strike by day, the RAF would bomb by night. The operation was designed to be relentless, 6 days of continuous assault to grind down Germany's air defenses once and for all. For the young crews of the 8th Air Force, Big Week felt like a death sentence. They knew the statistics. Only 1 in 3 would likely complete their tour. But the stakes were clear. If they could cripple the Luftwaffe now, the forthcoming Normandy invasion could proceed under friendly skies. We were told, recalled Pilot Lieutenant Charles Brown, that this was it, the turning point. Either we end them now or they'll keep killing us in the air until they win. The first raids met immediate resistance. Over Leipzig, flak shells burst so dense they looked like dark clouds stitched across the sky. German fighters, FW-190s and Bf-109s, swarmed in from every direction, attacking in tight, disciplined packs. American B-17s flew in defensive combat boxes, each aircraft protecting the others with interlocking fields of fire. The sky turned into a violent ballet of tracers and smoke. The sun was shining through a haze of burning oil, one waist gunner recalled. Planes on fire, parachutes opening, it was hell, bright and cold. On the ground, the German factories braced for annihilation. Workers fled as the first bombs fell, flattening assembly lines and warehouses. At the Regensburg Messerschmitt plant, hundreds of half-built Me-109s were destroyed. Yet the Luftwaffe refused to break. They fought back with desperate fury, shooting down dozens of bombers each day. In just 48 hours, the 8th Air Force lost 137 aircraft, entire squadrons vanished in flames or cloud. Radio intercepts captured the haunting last words of crews: engines gone, going down, tell them we tried. Still, the Allied command pressed on. New long-range escort fighters, the P-51 Mustangs, began to turn the tide. With their extended range and speed, they could now accompany the bombers deep into Germany. Mustang pilots like Captain Don Gentile and John Godfrey became legends, hunting Luftwaffe aircraft with deadly precision. The German fighter force, once dominant, found itself suddenly on the defensive. By the end of Big Week, both sides were bloodied. The Allies lost 262 bombers and 28 fighters, over 2,600 men killed or missing. But the Luftwaffe's losses were worse. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots were dead, and many factories lay in ruins. Their capacity to defend the Reich had been crippled. For the first time in the war, Allied bombers could roam the skies with growing impunity. Yet, amidst the wreckage, a shadow of mystery lingered. Dozens of bombers never reached their targets and were never found. Crews were listed as missing in action, presumed down somewhere between the clouds and the frozen forests below. Post-war search teams uncovered fragments scattered across Germany and Poland, but many aircraft had vanished entirely. Some historians believe that radio jamming and navigational errors led small groups to drift hundreds of miles off course. Others suspect they were destroyed in remote crashes that no one ever witnessed. The exact fate of several squadrons from the 100th and 445th bomb groups remains unknown. For those who survived, the memories of Big Week never faded. It wasn't just bombing, one veteran later said. It was endurance. You watched friends disappear in the smoke and you kept flying because you had to. The skies over Europe were no longer owned by Germany. From that moment forward, the Luftwaffe would never fully recover. Allied air supremacy was won not through a single victory, but through the cumulative weight of sacrifice. Big Week marked the turning point but not the end. In the months that followed, Allied command turned its attention to the ground war, and to the greatest airborne gamble of the entire conflict. Operation Market Garden would soon call on the same courage, the same aircraft, and the same fragile human hope, this time over the fields and rivers of the Netherlands, where air crews would face their most chaotic mission yet. By September 1944, the Allies were riding a wave of victory. Paris had been liberated, the German army was retreating on multiple fronts, and Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower sought one decisive strike to end the war by Christmas. The plan was audacious, an airborne and ground assault deep behind enemy lines, crossing the Rhine into Germany. Its name, Operation Market Garden. It was the largest airborne operation in history. Over 35,000 paratroopers and glider troops from the U.S. 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions, along with Britain's elite 1st Airborne Division and the Polish 1st Parachute Brigade, would be dropped across the Netherlands. Their mission: seize a corridor of key bridges leading to the town of Arnhem. Simultaneously, British ground forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's Operation Garden would advance north to link up with them. If successful, the Allies could bypass the Siegfried Line and strike at Germany's heart. But behind the optimism lay a web of fatal miscalculations. Intelligence reports warning of German armored divisions near Arnhem were dismissed. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies, essential for the transport aircraft, yet the Netherlands was infamous for sudden fog and low cloud. The airmen of the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces prepared to fly low and slow, carrying thousands of paratroopers and vulnerable C-47 Dakotas and fragile gliders. It felt like we were heading straight into the lion's den, recalled Pilot Flight Officer John Renshaw. On the morning of September 17, 1944, the skies over England filled with aircraft. From every direction, a massive aerial armada assembled, more than 2,000 planes towing gliders and transports in perfect formation. Civilians on the ground described it as a steel river flowing east. The paratroopers inside sat silent, faces streaked with camouflage paint, clutching rosaries and letters from home. For many, this would be their first and last flight into combat. As they crossed the Dutch coast, the reality of war erupted. Anti-aircraft guns opened up from the ground, turning the sky into a lethal web of flak. Explosions rocked the formations. Planes trailing smoke veered out of control, gliders broke loose prematurely, and parachutes filled the air like white blossoms amid black smoke. We were dropping men into a storm of fire, one C-47 co-pilot wrote in his logbook. Entire glider platoons were lost before even touching down. The paratroopers who made it to the ground faced chaos. The 101st secured its objectives around Eindhoven, but the 82nd struggled to hold the Nijmegen Bridge. Further north, the British 1st Airborne Division landed miles from its target, the crucial Arnhem Bridge, and immediately ran into heavy resistance from the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions. Radio communications broke down almost instantly. Orders were delayed, confusion spread, and units became isolated. The famed words of Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, commander at Arnhem Bridge, captured the spirit of defiance. "We're staying put, the bridge is ours." For the air crews above, the nightmare continued. The second day's resupply missions met devastating opposition. Flak guns and German fighters tore into the slow-moving transports. Pilots flew low to drop ammunition and rations to trapped paratroopers below, often flying through walls of tracer fire. One Dakota, hit in both engines, released its supplies just before exploding over the drop zone, its wreckage raining down alongside the very crates it carried. Many aircraft were lost without trace. Eyewitnesses later recalled seeing entire formations vanish into clouds of smoke, never emerging. Some were believed to have crashed into the marshes near the lower Rhine, where recovery was nearly impossible. Decades later, Dutch farmers still unearthed fragments of twisted aluminum, silent relics of those vanished flights. To this day, the full number of missing crews from the Arnhem drops remains uncertain. Despite overwhelming bravery, Operation Market Garden faltered. The ground forces failed to reach Arnhem in time. The bridge too far became the symbol of Allied overreach, a mixture of brilliance and hubris undone by misjudgment and weather. The British 1st Airborne suffered catastrophic losses. Of the 10,000 men who landed, fewer than 2,000 returned. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured. In the air, the toll was staggering. Over 300 aircraft and gliders were destroyed, with hundreds of pilots and crewmen listed as missing. Their names would later be carved into memorials across England and the Netherlands, but many bodies were never found. Historians suggest that several gliders crashed into flooded polderlands and sank within minutes, leaving no trace. Others may have burned entirely upon impact. The echoes of Market Garden lingered in the minds of survivors. Paratroopers who lived through the siege at Arnhem described watching low-flying Dakotas weaving through smoke, pilots waving before disappearing in flames. "They kept coming," one veteran said. "They knew what was waiting and they came anyway." Operation Market Garden was meant to open the road into Germany. Instead, it revealed the fragile coordination between air and ground and the devastating price of ambition. Yet even in failure, it became a testament to Allied courage and the relentless drive to liberate Europe. But the war was not over. The Allies learned from Arnhem's mistakes, and just months later, they would launch another massive airborne assault, this time across the Rhine itself. The skies of Western Germany would once again blaze with fire and steel, as the final air operation of the European war began, Operation Varsity. March 24, 1945, dawn broke cold and gray over Western Germany. The Rhine River, long considered an unbreakable natural barrier, glimmered beneath a haze of fog and smoke. On its western bank, Allied forces prepared for one of the final and most daring airborne operations of the European war. Its code name, Operation Varsity. This was not just another raid. Varsity would be the largest single-day airborne assault in history, surpassing even Market Garden. Over 16,000 paratroopers and glider troops from the British 6th Airborne Division and the U.S. 17th Airborne Division were to drop east of the Rhine near the towns of Wesel and Hamminkeln. Their objective was to secure the far side of the river, capture key bridges and crossroads, and pave the way for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's ground forces to advance into the heart of Germany. Unlike Market Garden, Varsity was planned with brutal lessons learned. This time there would be no distant drop zones or long delays. Airborne troops would land only a few miles beyond the Rhine, timed precisely with the crossing of ground forces. But the plan came with immense risk. The enemy knew the Allies were coming. German flak batteries and machine gun nests lined the fields east of the river. For the pilots of the C-47s, the mission felt less like a drop and more like flying into a wall of death. At 7 a.m., the first wave lifted off from England and France. Hundreds of C-47 Dakotas, C-46 Commandos, and gliders stretched across the sky in tight formation, a steel procession miles long. The noise was deafening. "You could feel the engines in your chest," recalled Lieutenant Arthur Shipley, a 17th Airborne pilot. "We were told it would be the last big one. Nobody said it would be the worst." As the aircraft neared the Rhine, German anti-aircraft guns erupted. The entire horizon turned into a storm of black flak bursts. Pilots were forced to maintain tight formations despite the chaos. To veer away meant collision or disorganization. "It was like flying through a field of exploding stars," one survivor later said. Planes caught fire midair, gliders broke apart before reaching the landing zones, and parachutes filled the smoky sky. The U.S. 17th Airborne Division, commanded by Major General William "Bud" Miley, landed first. Paratroopers dropped directly into enemy fire, many before even clearing their harnesses. Yet they fought fiercely, seizing villages and crossroads within hours. To the north, the British 6th Airborne under Major General Eric Bowles faced heavy resistance but quickly secured their primary objectives. The coordination between air and ground was near perfect. Montgomery's armored columns began crossing the Rhine within hours of the initial drops. But the air losses were severe. German flak guns had been positioned with deadly precision. The slower, unarmored C-46 transport aircraft proved especially vulnerable. Their fuel systems ignited easily under fire. Of the 72 C-40 SIXS used, nearly half were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. One squadron, the 435th Troop Carrier Group, lost 14 aircraft in a single run. "They were sitting ducks," said one glider co-pilot. "We were dropping men straight into hell." Several aircraft were seen trailing smoke as they disappeared eastward, never returning. Reports after the mission listed dozens of crews as missing. Some were last radioed near the Lippe River, their fate unknown. Years later, fragments of aircraft would be found scattered across German farmland, their serial numbers confirming long-lost crews of Varsity. Amid the devastation, acts of heroism stood out. Captain Cecil Petty, piloting a burning Dakota, refused to bail out, holding his crippled aircraft steady long enough for every paratrooper aboard to jump. He crashed seconds later, his sacrifice saving 24 men. Glider pilots, often forgotten in war histories, performed extraordinary feats of skill, landing amid gunfire and chaos to deliver reinforcements. Many did not live to see the end of the day. By nightfall, Operation Varsity was a success. The bridgehead east of the Rhine was secure. Within 48 hours, Allied tanks rolled across pontoon bridges and pushed deep into Germany. The mission achieved in a single day what Market Garden could not accomplish in a week. The cost, however, was staggering: over 1,500 Allied casualties, 56 transport aircraft destroyed, and nearly 400 gliders lost. For the air crews, the aftermath was bittersweet. They had delivered the final blow needed to open Germany's defenses, yet many of their comrades were gone, vanished into smoke and silence. It was victory, one pilot wrote in his diary, but not the kind you celebrated. Too many empty seats in the mess that night. Historians later described Operation Varsity as the last great gamble of the Allied air war, a triumph of coordination and precision, shadowed by loss. It demonstrated the full maturity of airborne warfare, but also its limits. Even in victory, the skies demanded their price. And though the Rhine crossing marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, it was not the end of the story. For the men who survived, memories of vanished squadrons and unmarked crash sites lingered long after peace returned. The war in Europe was drawing to a close, yet its echoes, the missing, the unaccounted, the unresolved, would continue to haunt historians for generations. As the Allies advanced toward Berlin, the wreckage of these missions dotted the continent, each a silent reminder of courage, chaos, and the perilous balance between success and sacrifice. These operations, from Ploiești to the Rhine, had defined the air war. But their mysteries, the disappearances, the miscommunications, the cost of daring, would remain. And as the guns of Europe finally fell silent, the question lingered: how many of the war's most dangerous missions had truly gone wrong, and how many stories were still waiting to be found beneath the clouds? When the war finally ended in May 1945, the guns fell silent, but the skies of Europe still carried ghosts. Thousands of aircraft lay scattered across fields, forests, and seas, some burned beyond recognition, others vanished entirely. For those who fought and flew in the Allied air campaigns, victory came with a shadow, the haunting memory of missions that had gone wrong, men who had never returned, and questions that would never be fully answered. The story of the air war had been one of daring and loss, of strategy and sacrifice. From the low-flying bombers over Ploiești to the moonlit precision of the dam busters, from the chaotic skies of Big Week to the fiery corridors of Arnhem and the Rhine, each operation carried the same fragile balance between triumph and tragedy. Together, they painted a portrait of human resolve and the steep cost of ambition. For commanders like Generals Doolittle, Spaatz, and Lee-Mallory, these missions were necessary gambles. Air power was still a young science, its potential immense but unpredictable. Mistakes could mean hundreds of lives lost in a single morning. Yet without these operations, the war might have dragged on for years longer. "We learned by doing," Doolittle later admitted, and sometimes the lesson came in blood. In the years following the war, investigations sought to recover what had been lost, not just aircraft but truth. Teams of historians, engineers, and even farmers stumbled upon fragments buried in the soil. A section of fuselage near Ploiești, a wingtip in the Dutch marshes, a dog tag found beside a rusted engine in a German field. Each discovery reopened a chapter of history, and with it, a story of courage rediscovered. Many of the men listed as missing in action would never be found, their names preserved only on memorial walls stretching from Cambridge to Manila. One of the enduring mysteries surrounded the missing bombers of Big Week. Decades later, fragments of AB-17 from the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, were found deep in a Bavarian forest, far from any known flight path. The wreckage suggested the crew had flown hundreds of miles off course before crashing in a storm. No one had seen them go down. It was as if the war had swallowed them whole. These recoveries became quiet acts of remembrance, a way of bringing closure even 70 years too late. For the airmen who survived, the memories were sharper than any medal or monument. "We never flew the same after that," one veteran of Operation Varsity said. Every empty seat was a reminder. Survivors often described the haunting silence after missions, the absence of chatter on the radio, the empty bunks back at base, the simple act of waiting for a plane that would never return. In the air war, loss was constant, but so was the duty to continue flying. As the decades passed, filmmakers and historians would immortalize these missions in documentaries, museums, and films, yet no retelling could fully capture the terror of those moments in the cockpit. Imagine the vibration of the engines, the rattle of flak against the fuselage, the smell of burning oil, and the weight of knowing that turning back wasn't an option. These men were not superhuman. They were young, frightened, and determined, ordinary people asked to do the impossible. Beyond the statistics and mission reports, the true legacy of these dangerous Allied air missions gone wrong lies in the human spirit that endured them. Their failures taught lessons that shaped the future of aerial warfare. The need for precision, for communication, for respect between air and ground. Many of today's flight tactics, from low-altitude strike coordination to electronic countermeasures, trace their origins to the improvisations made by crews in 1943 and 1944, desperate measures that saved lives and defined new doctrines. Yet even with all that progress, something essential remains timeless: the courage to take off when the odds seem insurmountable. That was the quiet power of the Allied airmen. They knew their missions might fail, that they might not return, and still they climbed into their cockpits and flew. Standing today among the rows of white headstones at Mattingly or Margareton, one can feel the weight of their story. Each name carved in stone marks a piece of the greater whole, the grand experiment of air power written in sacrifice. The missions that went wrong were not wasted. They forged the knowledge that made victory possible, even as they exacted their terrible cost. As the sun sets over the fields of Europe, the echoes of those engines seem to return for a moment, faint, distant, but unmistakable. The hum of courage, of fear, of humanity in its purest form. The story of these 5 air missions is not just about failure. It's about endurance and the fine line between disaster and destiny. In the end, history remembers them not for how they fell, but for the sky they dared to claim. Their missions changed the course of the war, and their losses changed the way we understand it. Even now, the search continues for those still missing, for the last fragments of aircraft buried beneath the soil of the continent they helped to free. They flew into danger and into history. And though some never came back, their stories, like their contrails, still stretch endlessly across the sky, fading slowly but never truly gone.